All right, we're good.
Yep.
Okay, I got the first chapter, and or will they explode? I can't remember the exact title of it. So I'm going to ask you guys, because I ask all these specific questions and you guys don't remember because it is hard to read. There's tons of details. So what jumped out at anybody in this first chapter?
What the way I reacted, and of course, my presentation on this was rather personal, was the stress that Zen tends to show on the violent overtones of certain aspects of the civil rights movement, whereas I feel that much of the change took place by more moderates who are still pushing for change, but not necessarily
Non-violent.
nonviolent, doing things behind the scenes sometimes, but still change with things which went in the direction of change.
Anybody else?
I found it interesting that several laws or multiple laws for civil rights were passed, but they never were reinforced. They never were, they didn't go into effect really. So it was kind of just like a gesture, like here's a little bit of something, but we're really not going to enforce it. So that struck me.
That's irritating.
Here's some crumbs, but we're not going to let you have them.
Can't have a real piece of the pie.
Yeah.
I was glad they mentioned some about Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr., how he was advocating for poor people and against the war. I don't know, if he had lived longer, maybe he could have had an impact in those areas also.
He was certainly moving in that direction by 67 and 68.
Okay, one thing that struck me. Oh, is somebody else having something to say?
I muted
Ken?
my husband by mistake.
Oh,
She does that all the time. No, I think a lot of the description of how the way law enforcement or some law enforcement treated Blacks and resistance organizers or protest organizers reminded me so much of how current events, things that are happening recently, and
Well,
how much of that has not changed.
That's very true.
yeah, in
Now-
North Carolina yesterday, there was an incident where the cops pepper sprayed a whole group of silent marchers going to the polls, including kids. So that's still happening. That
I
happened
didn't
yesterday.
see that.
Yeah.
I was too busy watching the barricade at the against Biden's bus in Austin.
Oh, yeah.
But it's interesting. I see some of this as almost a last gasp, that some of these changes are almost written into the system. Now, I was in the South and with family in '59, and at that time they had the court order requiring integrated interstate bus travel had been in effect only a few months. And I did some interstate bus travel going to the railhead to take the train back to New Mexico. But it was interesting to see how they would have the intrastate within the state colored, but the white and interstate Black waiting rooms separated. And they were trying to preserve the past, but at the same time, the law was producing an interaction between these people, which could not be reversed. So the law may be imperfect. I'm not contesting that. But little at a time, I've seen acquaintances making small actions for change. When we were serving a church in East Texas, one of the members, Black friend really, came as custom indicated to the back door to visit. But when he left, the owner of the premise insisted on letting him out the front door. These are just little changes, but each one of these add up.
Yes, they do. Katya?
Well, when I was reading this chapter, I had to remind myself that whatever judgment I put upon what is described here is my judgment of a white person with privilege. I mean, it's easy for me to say, well, the mood of the protest should have been, more calm or less violent, or the demands should have been more aggressive. But the thing is, I was not in that epicenter of violence, violence against people of color. I mean, what Zin emphasizes is that it's not something that erupted just out of nowhere. All of that, suppressed anger comes out of centuries of, a lack of freedom. And like we said, the laws, the small changes were passed, but they were actually not enforced, and the government acted like as if they could not enforce them. They sort of like left it up to the states, and preferred not to interfere. So I actually can relate to the anger. I mean, not personally. I mean, I'm not gonna put it, I never was in that situation and that position, but theoretically, hypothetically, I mean, I sort of, there's a reason why, the chapter is titled, "Or Does It Explode?" And, it's like at some point, if things are not fixed, like for centuries, they're not fixed, and there's the lynching, the prejudice, the exclusion. At some point, things are going to explode. And it's understandable, and I sort of feel like it's not my place to put that judgment on the community of color as to how they should have proceeded about, demanding their human rights.
Well, I found it interesting because Zen there was one of the questions that says, why do you think Henry Cabot Lodge wrote that one poem into the congressional record? And he made it sound like it was because of all the anger at the end. And you could see that they were not, going quietly into that good night. They still had a rebellion and whatnot. And so I looked it up online, which who knows if this is true? I don't even know what's true anymore. But it said that Henry Cabot Lodge read that into the congressional record because it was so inspirational. It was totally a different reason than Zen came up with. Has anybody heard about that? That it was like, we're gonna die fighting. We're not just gonna be. Did anybody else know anything about that?
No.
Ted?
No. I do know that anything and everything that's not absolutely vulgar or profane gets stuck in the congressional record. It does not consist simply of those records of things said in the Senate deliberating, but any senator can stick almost any fool thing they want to into that record. So it's very hard to prove that something was a major event simply because it's in the congressional record.
Okay. Well, that's what I just kept thinking of that it was a totally different thing than Zen had, but who knows which one's true? I don't know.
May I give a current illustration? Perhaps I've
Yes.
mentioned before. In our multicultural, multilingual state, we had the September, yes, presentation for AAUW by a black lady who's active in politics in the state. And she was complaining in the discussion following that it was on the, we got onto the Martinez Yazzie case, that she as a minority and the black community was not addressed at all in these particular suits. Well, the suits consisted of the Native American and the Spanish speaking communities. She speaks English. She's an Anglo like us, and therefore was considered part of the establishment. And she didn't recognize it. But in this crazy state, you can get people on different sides on the basis of language rather than skin color. And it's really funny to me to see when these things happen.
Okay, well, I was just thinking about being a teenager in the 60s and hearing all this, you know, the Black Panthers and all that, which I didn't understand at the time because I was a little white bread girl. But what did you guys think of that? Do you think they were loud enough? Because, okay, they got the right to vote in 1870. When were they really allowed to vote? Does anybody know?
Johnson's, I think, passed in 65, the Voting Rights Act, but there's still places where this is a no-no. It depends on some of the rural South still runs a pretty tight ship on this.
Oh, yeah.
When we were in Georgia, there was 9,000 people in the county. 3,000 of them were black. Only 30 were registered to vote. And all of those held jobs, or their spouses held jobs outside of the county, because it was known that if you worked within the county and endeavored to register to vote, you would lose your job.
That was in 1967 and 8.
After the Voting Rights Act was passed.
Well, I was surprised at all the ways that they tried to keep them from voting legally. I don't know, quote unquote. Do you guys remember reading any of the ways that they tried to keep the black people from voting?
Well, they're still doing that.
Yeah, they
Okay.
are.
What
Yeah,
they're still doing.
right. Yeah. Last year, there were 36,000 taken off the voting rolls in Georgia for something like they didn't put a period after their middle initial or something like that. And it was all black voters.
Yeah, yeah, it's still happening. This incident yesterday in North Carolina, it was black folks walking to the polls that got pepper sprayed.
Or in Houston, there's only one drop box for the absentee votes in the whole county. Just go on and on. Sure, this continues.
Well, and
Well, and they're still trying to redistrict everything in Texas too, to disenfranchise the black vote.
Well,
And-
they've done it.
And Hispanic.
and it's not a big incident, but I know at the school that I taught at, a middle school, it was a voting site. And my daughter went to vote there and they wanted to see her driver's license. She's black, but I've never had to show my driver's license when I've gone to vote.
Yeah,
But I knew enough from my brother to say, I need to talk to the polling judge. I think that was what it was called. But they have people there who officiate the thing. But it was her first time voting. I think she shouldn't have had to do that. And I've never had to do that. So, I mean,
Yeah,
it's
me either.
subtle, but
yeah.
things like that happen here.
Yeah, well, I think I recall having to show ID on occasion.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
Well,
it's a
that
mixed bag.
instance, I didn't have to on that election. So,
Yeah, actually, first-time voters have to show ID, even in New Mexico. Like when you vote first time ever, yeah, you have to show your ID.
I'll have to ask her because I bet she remembers.
Does she still live here in New Mexico? And,
Yeah, she does.
okay. All right, so then let's move this way just a little and think, what is there that we can do as, you know, white bread America? What can we do to help in any of that? Does anybody have any ideas?
Well, it would be really nice if Congress would look at the different districts, the gerrymandering that's been done to kind of get certain parties in power that were historically in power at the time the districts were drawn, because they really seem to be very creative and almost artistic at times. They don't make sense. That might be one thing that could help.
Have you ever seen the sketch of the Massachusetts division, which led to the term gerrymandering? The legislature behind it was a man by the name of Jerry, but it was gerrymandered because it looks like some sort of a lizard, some primitive critter.
You know, there's that thing I mentioned at a previous meeting about, there's that effort on the bipartisan initiative to improve democracy. And one of the things they want to see is that the districts be designed by bipartisan commissions instead of legislators, so that you don't have whichever party's in power designing that for the next 10 years. And that's one of their 13 recommendations.
Yeah.
What was it called? The bipartisan what?
Let me
Jennifer?
step away from the previous meeting, the one that's all the different ways they're recommending. Be right back, I'll go get it.
Oh, okay, thank you. You were just cutting off. I couldn't hear.
She's having some signal issues. She logged off and came back on to see if it helped, but it's still, it's freezing up on her.
Oh, okay. Well, I just want to know, because that sounds like something concrete that we could do.
Katya?
I'm sorry, Lisa, this is not to your question, but a couple of things I remember reading online is about the assassination of Martin Luther King. The observation that is made is that the moment he started talking about the war in Vietnam and poverty being the root of problems, that's when he got assassinated. And the second thing was about, you know, the difference between MLK and Malcolm X and how their messages differed. And an interesting point is that MLK actually kind of came out of the more of like middle class, you know, sort of like, you know, he and his family had means, and Malcolm X actually came out of poverty, out of the slums. And so, you know, I think it's actually quite valid. You know, it can be connected with the tone of their messages, sort of like desperate, very angry for Malcolm X, and kind of rightfully so, and a little more. I don't even know which adjective to choose here, but sort of kind of like going with the stream and playing by the system with MLK.
That is definitely a significant difference.
Yeah, it is. Jennifer, I put the name of the book in the chat. Is there anything else you wanted to say about it?
I'm putting in the chat the website. This is a free publication, and it's called Our Common Purpose: Reinventing American Democracy for the 23 multi-year process where they went and met with bipartisan groups to build consensus on ways to improve democracy. And it is excellent. It talks about a lot of different strategies, and only one of them would require a constitutional amendment. Everything else can be done in other ways. And the one that we're discussing, when you said what else can we do about gerrymandering, they want to work in each state to pass legislation, independent bipartisan commission designing districts, and not state legislators that have one party or the other in power.
Let's see, Jennifer. Jennifer, Does it mention anything? I don't know what to recommend. Does it mention anything about the Electoral College?
Yes, it has a bunch of recommendations. So it has 6 strategies and 31 recommendations.
Okay, so it does.
So let me find the one about the Electoral College.
Yeah, that is something that needs to be changed or eliminated, I feel.
The only one that would require a constitutional amendment is to
Good.
authorize regulation of money contributions to candidates so that you get around the Citizen United thing.
Yeah,
Well, the courts can reverse Citizen United if you get a different element on the courts. Just like the some of the 1880s and 90s anti-Black court decisions got reversed starting around the time of the Second World War, and it's still continuing.
but I think the Electoral College has to have a new amendment to
Correct.
the Constitution to get rid of it.
What do the rest of you think about the Electoral College?
I'm ambivalent.
Don't get me.
Don't get you started.
Go
Don't
ahead.
get me started. I tell you what, I firmly believe that every vote should count exactly the same. And I've been saying that for a long, long time. And I have arguments with people all the time on Facebook. But, you know, if you happen to live in a place that's heavily populated, so what? If you happen to live in a place that's not very populated,
Look, it's recommending that election day be changed to the match Veterans Day, and so that it's a day off for everybody.
Didn't it used to be when we were kids?
It's always been the first Tuesday in November as long as I can remember.
no,
Yes, but some places make that a holiday within the state.
Depends on if they're wanting to encourage voting or not. Dave, what were you saying?
I got
You
lost.
said that you've had arguments with people and you want people to have every vote count.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I understand the thing that says, you know, that if California and New York, you know, they would control everything if we didn't have the Electoral College. But I don't think that's right, because we do have senators and we have representatives that are based on, you know, population. And but as far as the president is concerned, I think every vote should be the same. You know, because I don't see why I'm any more important than someone over there, or he's any more important than I am as far as my vote's concerned, no matter where I live. That's just the way I feel about it. And I know there's a lot of arguments against that, but that's the way I feel.
Ryan?
There are ways to, I mean, personally, I think the Electoral College should be eliminated so we have a direct election of the president. But there are ways to improve it before we get to that space. Currently, a large number of states require all their electors to vote according to, in the same way, according to the popular vote in the state. If they changed, like some states have, to portion out the electoral votes according to the popular vote in the state, it would more closely represent the popular vote. Now, including senators in it skews it slightly toward the smaller, less populous states. I don't know how significant that is statistically, but it gives more votes to fewer people, including the senatorial representatives in the Electoral College.
And the other side of that.
Go ahead, Dave.
The other side of that is there are some states apparently who allow their electors to vote however they please, whether the popular vote says this and so or whatever, they are apparently allowed to vote the way they want to. And I think it needs to be consistent. If we're going to have it, it needs to be consistent throughout the states in terms of, you know, if you're going to portion them up by the percentage of the vote and all that kind of stuff, or if you're just going to give one guy all the votes, you know. I think
Or
it needs to be
gal.
consistent. Yeah.
Anne?
Okay, and
We had a discussion with our granddaughter today. We were picking her up from her dad's, and we saw all these signs, you know, for the different candidates, and we had on the radio. And she was asking, well, why are they encouraging people to vote? And we talked about it a little bit, and then she had to do a report on the Electoral College, so she knew about that. And she was saying, well, if everybody's vote doesn't count, why do they want people to vote? And I was trying to say, well, it's hopefully so the Electoral College will represent what people feel, but there's a lot of sentiment that maybe it's not the best way. Ken?
Oh, I had read somewhere, and it was disturbing. Hopefully it's not true, that in states with Republican-controlled legislatures, in some cases they can essentially fire all the electors and replace them with people who will vote for the candidate that they want.
That sounds like Texas.
Have
It does sound like
a
Texas.
different select of the electors depending upon which party they are affiliated with. So it's sort of in the bag to begin with. I think the only two states that allow a splitting are Maine and Nebraska. And it's expected that Nebraska may send a Democrat from one of its districts to Congress this coming year in what amounts to a solid red state. But it's the district that includes Omaha and is urban.
Katya?
Kind of an interesting split.
Well, another thing is automatic voter registration. I think it was it was filed in the previous legislative session in New Mexico. I don't think it went anywhere, but that's another thing I had to learn and sort of try to understand when I moved to America, because like in Russia, as soon as you turn 18, you are like automatically, like there's no even such thing as registered to vote. Like you just go and vote. And like I really, like it was really hard for me to understand why in this big democracy, you're first supposed to register to vote. And then like you can be kicked off the list pretty much, like you change your address and you didn't notify people. So it just seems like there are all these barriers, like, you know, to keep people from voting. It's like, if you have whatever, I mean, like if you live in New Mexico, you have your driver's license, why do you need to be also registered to vote? So that's a measure that kind of, you know, I can't remember who sponsors it, but it was filed. It just never, I don't think it ever got anywhere. I don't remember. I can't remember if it passed.
Yeah, they wanted to pass it so that you could just register to vote when you got your driver's license renewed, and it was really easy. And I don't think it did pass, and it may have had something to do with feeling like our MVD system was already having a hard time keeping up with all the real ID workload or whatever. But
When I
that is
moved
another
here,
one of the recommendations in this publication, is that they think that through state and federal legislation, they want to establish same-day registration and universal automatic voter registration with sufficient funding, which is kind of what the barrier was from doing it through MVD, with sufficient funding so that those agencies could actually carry that out.
Betsy, you were going to say something? No, you're good. Ted?
Well, it sounds like a joke, but it wasn't. The saying in Chicago that one went out to vote early and often. And there's a long history there of recent burials and tombstones having the name listed and the location established and people voting in the dead person's name and the whole routine. So there has been at times an enormous amount of corruption in certain parts of this country in terms not only of keeping people from voting, but voting people that are being voted that no longer exist. So there is some background in this.
Well, and for what Katya was saying and Jennifer, when I moved here 3.5 years ago, I went in and got my driver's license and registered to vote all in one trip. They asked me if I wanted to register if I wanted to vote. And I said, yeah. And so it was automatic when I got mine. Now I've not had to renew one yet. So I don't know if that's the issue or not, but I didn't have to do a separate thing to register to vote when I
You
moved
don't
here.
have to re-register to vote. You just have to let them know if you move.
Okay. And
Unless you don't vote for so long that they think you're inactive. But if you vote regularly, you will stay on the rolls.
okay.
Earlier today, I was reading an article on CNN. I think that it's maybe more controversial, but in our country, we have a lot of people who are felons that happen to be people of color. And if you're a felon, you're not allowed to vote. So it's another kind of subtle way of disenfranchising minorities.
Right.
And if the purpose of going to prison is to rehabilitate people, and I don't know if that is the purpose or if it's to punish, but if it's the purpose to rehabilitate people back into society, it seems like they should maybe have the right to vote, or at least that should be looked at if it's a nonviolent crime, possibly.
And some states do allow you to vote after you've served your time as a felon. Dave?
I got no rub with registering to vote, because there has been some issues in the past. I realize that. My rub is the document or whatever you need to go register is impossible to get for some people because of whatever. And I think that's wrong. In some states, I know that you had to have a specific, maybe it was a real driver's license. I don't know I can't remember exactly what it was, but if you didn't have that, you couldn't register. But to get that particular document required, dancing a jig or something like that. And I think that's wrong.
Mm-hmm. Katya?
Hey, we're about
Katya?
Katya, and then I need to say something.
Well, it's something I have read is that, like, to what Dave said, in poor urban areas, a lot of people don't have driver's licenses.
Right.
I don't know. It's hard to imagine, like, how you go around without a certain ID, because if you buy alcohol, you need to show it. But that's what's being pointed out, is that, yeah, a lot of poor, and especially like people of color from poverty simply may not have a driver's license, and that's what becomes an obstacle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, all I need to say is that we're over halfway through, so whenever it's time, we need to switch over to Vietnam.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Dave.
Go ahead. Let's switch to Vietnam.
Oh, okay.
He knows about Vietnam too.
I've been there.
He was
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
I was there. Yeah.
Yep.
So,
Can I say something real quick?
Yes.
Sure.
I saw a cute thing on the news last night or a couple of days ago about Susan B. Anthony's gravestone. People go there and place their "I voted" sticker on her gravestone as a sign of respect and honor and all that. And it was messing up the marble of her gravestone. So they put plexiglass on it. And so it's now okay and good, and they're not defacing her gravestone anymore. I think that's a great idea.
That is a great idea.
It is cute.
Before we move over, I just want to draw your attention to what Jennifer put in the chat. She has the website and a little bit more information about our common purpose. So be sure and take a look at the chat and get the information off of there you need. All right, Eleanor.
Okay, we ought to at least talk about Vietnam some, much as that war was not popular in any way, sense, or form. So my first question about Vietnam is, how were organized human beings able to defeat organize modern technology. And is it surprising to you that they did? Why or why not? In other words, Viet Cong did not have all the technology that Americans had when we went in there.
But they had the motivation, according to the
Yeah,
author.
yeah.
They knew the land, and they knew where they lived, and it seemed like they were just so highly motivated. They didn't like the government that had been put in place.
Yeah, I'd want to say one thing about this whole thing. You know, Ho Chi Minh actually was quoting our own Declaration of Independence at us, that for freedom. I mean, this is what he wanted. We were the example he wanted to follow, and yet when he wrote to Truman, laying out the groundwork for what he wanted as a revolution, Truman didn't even respond to him. You know, and the reason for that, as I understood it from the book, was because we were going to support France, and that basically they had all these natural resources we wanted to keep our hands on. And we didn't want to take a chance of Indochina going communist, of the Asian countries. Yeah, Dave, I'd like to hear some input from you about that war.
Well, I don't even know where to start. You know, I got so sick and tired of the excuse, we're in this war to stop the spread of communism. And that was a bunch of crap, if you'll pardon my expression.
Yeah, it was crap.
It was for people to make a lot of money, I believe. I really believe that. You know, the people that live there, and I think I've told this story before. I don't know. I don't remember how I told this group, but I'm a chance to have a little short chat with the Vietnamese man, and he knew a little bit of English. I mean, he could understand pretty well what I was saying. And so very proudly I said, well, sir, how is your life going to change once Vietnam becomes a democracy? He looked at me and he kind of shrugged his shoulder and he said, you know, what I want is a place to lay my head, something to eat, and for people not to mess with me. And that's all they wanted, you know, and they were, yeah, they were communists or you know, heavy socialists. I'm not sure exactly what the heck they were doing, but I don't know if we had actually won the war, if it would have made differences that were much to their benefit, because I don't think they really knew how to live any other way than the way that they were living, and they were very happy and content to live that way. I think it's the way I got it.
Yeah. So to most of the people there, in other words, it was irrelevant. They just wanted peace and to be able to live their lives.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was my take on it. And then of course, you know, a lot of people took a lot of advantage of the things that were happening over there. You know, they made a lot of money off of it over there, and of course, people over here made a lot of money too.
Yeah. This is.
And with no real mission in my mind. I don't think we ever really had a mission the whole time I was there. I never felt like, you know, we were there and we were doing what we needed to do, and we were losing a lot of people and we were killing a lot of people. And but I didn't see an end that was going to be wonderful. Even if we had won the war, I didn't see where that was going to make a whole lot of difference.
Which we didn't. Yeah.
Well, what's left out of this, to me, is the fact that during the Second World War, Ho Chi Minh was our ally, and we double-crossed him in favor of the French after the war was over. So basically, we deserved what we got.
Gotcha.
Well, and then for the French, Indochina was a colony. So it's like basically, in supporting the French, America was supporting colonialism.
Mhm.
And to me, ultimately, it goes to, if we declare that we support people's right for self-determination, like whatever that looks like, be that communism, socialism, you know, whatever it is like you can't force democracy over, I mean, even if it is democracy, even though reading Zinn, you know, how the NLF was basically, you know, coming to villages and having them elect like, you know, their own like representation, and you just can't mandate the world to implement the order that seems, you know, like preferable to you. So it seems like whichever way, it's just hypocrisy.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah, Ted.
Well, another aspect on this, which Washington still hasn't realized, is that you don't win wars of colonialism versus national liberation. And to the extent that Vietnam was a war of national liberation of the Vietnamese people against the French, it would have continued until they won. Like India went independent. The French lost West Africa. The English lost East Africa. We gave up the Philippines rather than have another fight. But these wars of national liberation, when the people in a nation decide they want the foreigners out, there's not a whole lot you can do about it.
Well, and that's what I felt about Iraq, is going into Iraq and trying to force our way onto a culture that they did not understand. And we're paying for it still this day. Because it's that whole imperialism, colonialism, everything that we know what's right for the world. And you don't know what's right for you, so we're going to fix it for you. That's the attitude that I see in a lot of our international relations.
And it doesn't work long term.
No, it doesn't work short term either. It's a lot of people killed. Yeah. And
unfortunately, it seems the U.S. is more prone to get involved if there's some economic incentive. Iraq, oil. And I'm not saying for sure that we should have done anything in, is it Syria, where they have the chemical war on the civilians that was going on? Gosh, I guess that was in Obama's time. The line in the sand, was that Obama's time?
Yes.
And I don't know what the answer is, but you still see these pictures of civilians that are getting bombed and burned. And at one point, the United States had the moral or the authority or whatever to be concerned about other places and try to be a peacekeeper. And maybe it's only if we have an economic incentive, but it's troubling to see us get involved in places where there's oil, but maybe not get involved when there's something we could do to help, but maybe it's not our right or our place either. I don't know.
Okay, here's a question kind of to tie the last chapter to this one. And that is, what are the connections that civil rights activists made between American domestic policies and the American pursuit of war in Vietnam?
Well, most of the people that were drafted, the young men, were from the poorer economic area, you know, and they kind of like World War II, they didn't have the means to go to Canada or just get out of service. So they were sent over to Vietnam in larger numbers than the upper class kids going to college and stuff like that.
Well, I know because it happened to my husband the day that we graduated from college. The next day he was open to the draft. And so he joined the New Mexico Air National Guard because he didn't want to go to Vietnam. And guess what? they called it to active duty, and they sent about half of the guys to Vietnam, and he was in that half.
Oh, wow.
But once they got over there, now he was a medic, and they were on a base that was an in-country R&R place. In other words, it was a place where people who didn't, for whatever reason, they weren't going to leave the country, but they still needed to get out of the war. So they sent them to this base, which happened to be on the beach of the South China Sea. So it was a nice place to be. But once they got over there, the officers and things that were there said, well, you know, it's nice that all of you came, your cooks, your medics, your whatever else. All we wanted was your airplanes and your pilots.
Mm.
But they all stayed for a year and then came back. So it was Vietnam, but it wasn't the Vietnam that most people experienced when they were over there.
Well, that's the way it was for me too. I was on an air base. It was an actual base where we had planes and the whole bit. It was a complete, yeah. So no, I wasn't out in the sticks by any stretch of the imagination, but thank goodness.
Yeah, we had a friend from college who went into the Marines and went over there as you know, a junior officer. And he had literally one of his men, they were out in the jungles, and one of his men one night was carried off by a tiger, and that was the last they knew of him.
Whoa, a tiger.
Wow.
So there was Vietnam, and then there was Vietnam. So
Yeah, yeah.
Wow. Katya?
When I was reading this chapter, I had the realization that I've never read a book, like a fiction book, that is written from the perspective of someone from the North Side. Like all of the books, like I just recently read Monkey Bridge, which is a book about a family that came to the States from Vietnam, but they were in Saigon. And I don't think I've ever read a book that actually gave the perspective of someone from the North who supported the NLF, or, you know, it's just interesting to me. It seems like it's also kind of cherry picked, like in literature, you know, to give the perspective of the side which America supported in the war as opposed to the opposing side.
Okay. Anybody else? Because I have one more question for sure. I think we have time to discuss some that I think is pertinent to today as well as Vietnam. And that is, what evidence is there that soldiers, leaders, the US public were encouraged to dehumanize the Vietnamese population? And then what is the outcome of dehumanization?
We do that with the blacks here. That's how they were able to enslave them. Yeah, that 3/5 of a human being meant that they were less than human, so you could own them and treat them however you wanted to.
So do you feel that dehumanization is still a large part of contemporary life warfare? Warfare is the word they use in the question, but I'm thinking of just in general, the dehumanization of anybody that we don't like, or we're racist or whatever.
That's why it's always good to put true stories about people's lives to the statistics so that you can get the embodied experience. Ryan?
There's a PBS special that aired a couple of years ago about St. Francis called The Sultan and the Saint, but it includes a rather hefty dose of neurology to talk about othering people and how you make someone into an enemy. And it's exactly what you described, the dehumanization. And the fact is that when we look at a human being, we empathize with them. And so it requires a great deal of work to dehumanize them. it's the only way that we can be convinced to hurt another person, to think of them as less than human. And we're trained to do that a lot through racism and through government propaganda when there's a war on. We're told to see certain qualities. Skin color is a pretty common one now because it's immediately available to the eyes, as a way to objectify someone as not only other, but less than, and therefore it's acceptable to harm them in some way.
And it's like Ann put in the chat about the immigrant children. Those immigrants, the asylum seekers, those who are coming in here are so dehumanized that they can justify ripping their children away from them and locking them up because they shouldn't have come over here anyway. And they don't put faces and lives to the stories of what they represent. Lisa.
I was just thinking of how they did that in World War II in Oak Ridge when I was reading through those papers from last week. It called the Japanese people Japs and Nips and other demeaning type things. And then it had a picture of this little man being kicked by a big soldier, you know, and we're going to kick the Japs out. And I thought, my family, I come from the Southeast, and my family was very prejudiced. Not my mother, but everybody else. And to take what they did with the Japs and the Nips and do it to the blacks and the N-words, it wasn't a far reach.
Yeah. I think
Jennifer?
We came across a stack of really old comic books when we were cleaning out, I think after my dad died. Anyway, really old comic books. And there was some Wonder Woman comic books from the World War II era. And they are appalling. Wonder Woman was terrible. I mean, the way those comic books talked about fat people, Japanese people, it was just, it was horrible. Wonder Woman was not a good superhero at that originally. I just have to say, if you look at an original Wonder Woman comic book from World War II, it was appalling.
Yeah,
That's really interesting. I apologize. I don't know if I was next, but I just wanted to build on something Ryan said too about how we dehumanize people based on their appearance. In the chapter, there was a part where there was some military person talking about how we couldn't really reason with the people from Vietnam because they were so different from us. They didn't even think like we do, that our ways of looking at the world were so disparate, there was no commonality. And I think we can agree that we all have different perspectives based on our language and our culture, but to make it so different that we couldn't even reach any common ground, I found that striking.
That's that idea of other. If other is different than me, then there's something wrong with other. It's not me. Brian?
Well, this is a fear reaction, which we're seeing a great deal of today in our political situation. Being literally so afraid of the other are the cultural and ethnic changes taking place in the United States is producing some very bizarre behavior on the part of some people. And I see it as a fear reaction to a change which is not understood and rejected.
It's the trying to hang on to the ultimate power and not willing to share it because they're different, rather than looking at what is common between us. Ryan?
I ordinarily might do this in private, but because this is being recorded in a public setting, I'll offer it here. The words that Lisa was using to describe Japanese people are not just antiquated, they are thought of as racial slurs. And so I'd like
Yeah.
everybody to know that we should not be using those words. Like you muted yourself saying N-words, those words also should not cross our lips.
Dave,
Valid. I think it's valid to share what the past experience was, though. I mean, I
Yeah.
agree. We don't use them now, but they have been used. Dave.
Oh, I kind of lost track of what I was going to say.
Okay,
But,
Ted.
I agree with what Brother Ryan's saying. You know, we had lots of great terms for the Vietnamese people when we were over there, and none of them were very nice.
Well, and growing up in Southeast Texas, we had a lot of derogatory terms for those folks south of the border that were coming in and taking over. Ted.
Response to Katya here, Tony Hellerman is noted as a novelist for the Navajo, but he wrote one Vietnam novel, Finding Moon, and is very ambivalent in terms of attitudes towards both North and South. That might be an interesting read to see a different take on what was going on. He was an actual World War II combat veteran, wounded and lost an eye, etc. So this is a combat veteran writing about a different war and has an interesting take on it. That might be helpful. And he's widely available because he's a local author.
Well, we are approaching 4:05 and I have another meeting at 4:15. So this is my Sunday. Good conversation. The next.
I didn't catch the title. Ted, could you?
Finding Moon. The man's name is Moon, M-O-O-N.
but it's written by Tony Hillerman.
Right. Yeah. No, I'm familiar with Tony Hillerman. I've never.
I don't know how to do chat,
You.
so sorry.
The next lecture will be available on Wednesday. There's a little blip in the middle of it that, again, got froze up, but I reviewed it and I think it's well worth just moving on. And I have it scheduled to go public on Wednesday morning instead of asking them to re-record it. That will be chapters 19 and 20 that we'll do next Sunday. Then we're going to do 21 and 22 on the 15th. And then we're going to do 23, 4, and 5 because 25 is short. We'll do that on the 22nd. So we'll finish up on the Sunday before Thanksgiving. The Sunday after Thanksgiving is Advent. And we'll start an Advent study that week too on Zoom.
It works out good.
Yes, it does. So we'll finish on the 22nd. Everyone can wrap it up. And if you have a book that you would like to see us do a book study on next, certainly let us know. There are plenty, and I have a whole supply here next to my office at the house at my dining table now. If anybody is interested in exploring some of these other books on racism, I have several that we could look at. Have a blessed week. Be safe, vote, and counter the violence out there. Yeah.
Thank you.
And we'll pray us through this week and into a new reality next Sunday. All right. Good to be.